Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. The most prominent critic in the West of the war in Ukraine is Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer says that the West, and the United States in particular, is responsible for the war in Ukraine. This makes him the most despised figure in Europe other than Vladimir Putin himself, and many people have sought to cancel him, shouted down from various events trying to have him cancelled from the University of Chicago. I absolutely disavow that. I am happy to hang out with Professor Mearsheimer, stand side by side with him. We have a profound difference on this particular subject, but he is a towering intellectual figure, and I respect contrarians. I respect people that stand against the Washington consensus, particularly the foreign policy elite. I know what the price is for doing that, but one has to say that American foreign policy stewardship over the past 25 years has not been fantastic, and the contrarians have often been right. Anyway, many of my Russian interlocutors have forwarded me work of Professor Mearsheimer over the past few months as if I'd never heard who he was, saying this will blow my mind and open my eyes to what's really going on there. So clearly his work is admired in Russia. Now, I am very familiar with all of Professor Mearsheimer's work, but there is one speech that he's made that I haven't seen yet. And this was done in Florence, and it's titled The Causes and Consequences of the Ukraine War. Now, I am looking forward to watching this because the other one that I've seen and very familiar with, most of you would be as well, is a speech he gave 5 or 6 years ago talking about Ukraine as it was then. But now that a war has actually happened, I would like to see Professor Mearsheimer reflect on the conflict as it's evolved. But let's get into it. So I'm just going to hit play, and I'll fast forward to interesting bits because it looks like it's a very long, in fact, it hasn't even started yet. Okay, skip.
But when the outcome is disastrous, much attention is paid to the origins of the conflict. People want to know, how did we get into this terrible situation? I have witnessed this phenomenon twice in my lifetime. First with the Vietnam War, and second with the Iraq War. In both cases, Americans wanted to know, how did their country miscalculate so badly?
Well, we'll be in furious agreement there. Vietnam and Iraq were absolute catastrophes, not just militarily, but strategically. And for American prestige, America would have been far better to have avoided both of those conflicts. Unlike Iraq War, unlike the Vietnam War, this is not an American war in Ukraine. The United States did not start this war and did not seek this war and did everything possible to prevent the war.
Potential threat to their country, a point they have made repeatedly for many years. Specifically, I am talking about America's obsession with bringing Ukraine into NATO.
Does the United States have an obsession of bringing Ukraine into NATO? I'm not at all convinced of that. I'll listen to his argument.
Washington and its Western allies are committed to decisively defeating Russia in Ukraine and employing comprehensive sanctions to greatly weaken Russian power.
I wish that were true. I would like to see the United States doing a hell of a lot more to bring Russia to its knees in Ukraine and to chase in the armed forces completely.
Let me now lay out my argument in greater detail, starting with a description of the conventional wisdom about the causes of the conflict. It is widely and firmly believed in the West that Putin is solely responsible for causing the Ukraine crisis and certainly the ongoing war. He is said to have imperial ambitions, which is to say he is bent on conquering Ukraine and other countries as well, all for the purposes of creating a greater Russia that bears at least some resemblance to the former Soviet Union. In other words, Ukraine is Putin's first target, but not his last.
I think that's a solid articulation of the conventional wisdom, and at the risk of sounding conventional, I broadly agree that that is what's happening. Although I disagree that Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union in any way. I think he despises the Soviet Union, and perhaps we'll explore this more, but he certainly does have imperial ambitions. He wants to restore Greater Russia. He doesn't accept the legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent sovereign state, and therefore is trying to reincorporate as much of Ukraine as he can without directly challenging NATO. And I agree that if he's successful in taking over Ukraine, NATO would be a logical target, particularly in the Baltic countries, and now with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, those countries as well.
As one scholar put it recently, he is, quote, acting on a sinister, long-held belief to erase Ukraine from the map of the world. Given Putin's purported goals, it makes perfect sense for Finland and Sweden to join NATO and for the alliance to increase its force levels in Eastern Europe. After all, Imperial Russia must be contained.
I agree with that summary completely, although I would like to see the greatest burden of NATO forces in Europe being placed on the European powers themselves, given, as I've said many times, the rise of China and America's focus in the East Asian region.
Well, this narrative is repeated over and over in the mainstream media and by virtually every Western leader. There is no evidence to support it. I want to repeat that. There is no evidence to support it.
That is a very unimpressed looking audience, so it doesn't seem to be preaching to the choir. Maybe I'm wrong here. We'll see how the audience reacts. To say that there is no evidence to support this claim is a bold one, and that's a very high standard he's going to have to meet, because if anyone produces evidence to the contrary, and I can think of a number of examples just off the top of my head, then it kind of pokes a lot of holes in Professor Mearsheimer's argument. But before I respond, I'll let him articulate his view on this.
For invading Ukraine. For example, some emphasize that he said that Ukraine is an artificial state, or it is not a real state.
To be fair to Professor Mearsheimer, he is articulating the conventional wisdom very well. So I am curious as to how he'll respond to it.
Openly and honestly. To make the case that Putin was bent on conquering all of Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia, it is necessary to provide evidence that first, he thought it was a desirable goal, that second, he thought it was a feasible goal, and third, he intended to pursue that goal. There is no evidence, let me repeat, there is no evidence in the public record that Putin was contemplating, much less intending, to put an end to Ukraine as an independent state and make it part of a greater Russia when he sent his troops into Ukraine.
Okay, a few things to pick up there. First, the claim that Putin has no designs on taking over areas of Ukraine and absorbing into Russia. Well, he's already done that. I mean, Crimea was literally annexed from Ukraine and taken into Russia. So it's already demonstrated that Putin has designs on Ukrainian territory, regardless of the expansion of NATO. The other thing that Mearsheimer has said here is that when Putin's claims that Ukraine is an artificial construct, that doesn't mean that Putin intended to invade and wage war and take over the whole country. And I presume Mearsheimer is referring to the speech Putin made on the 21st of February this year when recognizing the breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Clearly the most comprehensive remarks Putin ever gave on the subject, a full hour-long speech. Now, he starts off with a historical chronology from Putin's point of view, saying that Ukraine was artificially constructed by Russia, specifically the Bolshevik Soviets. But then Putin went on for the next 25 minutes excoriating every single decision the communists made, particularly Lenin and Stalin in the administration of Ukraine. It's clear that Putin despises the USSR. He is not a communist. And when he says that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy, he's not talking about the collapse of Marxist ideology. He's complaining about the impact this had on the nation state of Russia and what he perceives as Greater Russia. In other words, Ukraine's separation from Russia is the dismembering of the Russian state from Putin's point of view, and therefore taking over Ukraine is nothing more than the restoration of the Russian state in his mind. So I think he gave very clear evidence in that speech that he wanted to take over the whole country because he was excoriating people who made terrible decisions of the past. And while he recognized that they had to live with those decisions, it was obvious he wanted to change it. He wanted to become another Peter the Great, another Catherine, and basically restore Russia in his mind to its greatest possible extent. Now, all of that is completely ahistorical. The Ukraine region as it is today spent many centuries as part of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, the Duchy of Lithuania. And so, these issues can be contested, but clearly in Putin's mind, he sees Ukraine as part of Russia, its existence as an artificial construct, and its separation is drifting towards the West as being against Russia's interests and totally antithetical to Putin's vision of the Russian Empire restored as he would like. Also putting a lot of emphasis on the West here, Mearsheimer, and I'll keep listening, but so far he's kind of left out what the Ukrainians themselves are doing. So he's saying that we've led Ukraine down the primrose path, but Ukraine's own policies, their velvet revolutions, these sorts of things have happened within Ukraine to pull it out of Russia's orbit. So it's not just the United States coming along and saying, here, you can have all these things if you turn on Russia. No, a lot of things happened within Ukraine itself. Anyway, let's keep listening.
In fact, there is significant evidence that Putin recognized Ukraine as an independent country. In his July 12th, 2021 article, which I assume many of you have looked at, about Russian-Ukrainian relations, which proponents of the conventional wisdom often point to as evidence of his imperial ambitions, he tells the Ukrainian people in that article, you want to establish a state of your own? You are welcome. Regarding how Russia should treat Ukraine, he writes, there is only one answer, with respect. He concludes that lengthy article with the following words, and what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide. That's not evidence of somebody who's interested in swallowing Ukraine and making it part of Russia.
To be fair to Professor Mearsheimer, that's a solid point. You'll never hear, for example, a Chinese leader say the status of Taiwan is up to the Taiwanese people. They'll always say that Taiwan is part of China and must be reintegrated into the Chinese mainland one way or another. One could argue, however, with Putin, is that he wants the unification of Ukraine into Russia to happen naturally, or failing that to have the status of Belarus, but under no circumstances does it drift to the West. In other words, he might say it's up to the Ukrainian people, but his actions demonstrate, I think, conclusively that there are limits to that sovereign decision-making of the Ukrainian people.
Springboard for Western aggression against Russia, a subject I will say more about shortly. One might argue that Putin was lying about his motives, that he was attempting to disguise his imperial ambitions. As it turns out, I have written a book, one of the few books, about lying in international politics. It's entitled Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. And it is clear to me that Putin was not lying. For starters, one of my principal findings in the book is that leaders do not lie much to each other. They lie more often to their own publics. Regarding Putin, whatever one thinks of him as a human being, he does not have a history of lying to other leaders. Although some assert that he frequently lies and cannot be trusted, there's actually little evidence of him lying to foreign audiences. Moreover, he has publicly spelled out his thinking about Ukraine on numerous occasions over the past 2 years. And he has consistently emphasized that his principal concern is Ukraine's relations with the West.
So Professor
especially
Mearsheimer
with
has
regard
essentially
to NATO.
contradicted himself. He uses the line from Putin in July of 2021, but then says, no, it doesn't exist. Russia has its own interests in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the ability to make decisions for itself. And Russia reserves the right to use force should Ukraine do something that Russia doesn't like. I mean, he's basically conceded the point right there. I'm curious for what Professor Mearsheimer will say as to what the motivation was. What was the actual strategic objective of using military forces by invading Ukraine in the manner that it did?
Perhaps the best indicator that Putin is not bent on conquering and absorbing Ukraine is the military strategy Moscow has employed from the start of this campaign. The Russian military did not attempt to conquer all of Ukraine. That would have required a classic blitzkrieg strategy that aimed at quickly overrunning all of Ukraine with armored forces supported by tactical air power. That strategy was not feasible, however, because there were only 190,000 soldiers in Russia's invading army, which is far too small a force to vanquish and occupy Ukraine.
I completely agree with Mearsheimer that 190,000 troops was not enough to seriously threaten the Ukrainian state, which begs the question, why did Putin do it? And I have my own explanation, perhaps Mearsheimer has another one, but my view is that Putin invaded under many false assumptions. He assumed that Zelensky was unpopular and would fall, that the Ukrainians would welcome the Russian forces with open arms, deposing Ukraine's own corrupt leaders, that the relatively modest force, welcomed in a bloodless way, would essentially show to the rest of Europe that Ukraine was on Russia's side, and that Ukraine would either become part of Russia through referendum administered by the Russians, or they would change their constitution, have new leadership that were amenable to Russian interests, much like Belarus is today, and that these assumptions were all wrong, which is why the invasion failed, because he didn't send enough troops and military forces in to do a traditional blitzkrieg. He didn't do the preparation with his soldiers to prepare them for such a conflict. And when all of these assumptions proved false, well, they had to radically curtail their military strategy. So Mearsheimer is kind of, I wouldn't say making a straw man, but his argument doesn't preclude that Putin's intention was to take over all of Ukraine. It's merely that Putin sent a force that he didn't think was going to be facing a determined resistance in the form of a united Ukrainian country.
What about contemporary Ukraine? It's obvious from Putin's July 12th, 2021 essay, his famous essay, that he understands that Ukrainian nationalism is a powerful force, and that the civil war in the Donbass, which had been going on since 2014, had done much to poison relations between Russia and Ukraine. He surely knew that Russia's invasion force would not be welcomed with open arms by Ukrainians, and that it would be a Herculean task for Russia to subjugate Ukraine if it had the necessary forces to conquer the entire country, which it did not have. Finally, it's worth noting that hardly anyone made the argument that Putin had imperial ambitions from the time he first took office in 2000 until the Ukraine crisis first broke out on February 22nd, 2014. That's 14 years. Nobody made the argument that he had imperial ambitions in his first 14 years in office.
It's this kind of remark that I think gets Professor Mearsheimer in a bit of trouble. because right now I'm hearing the screams of everyone living in the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the former Soviet republics, saying that's exactly what Putin's intention always was, and that's precisely what they've been trying to tell the world for 20 years. It's one thing to kind of go in afterwards and say, yeah, you were right, we didn't listen, but to just say that they weren't speaking up at all is totally false. And so Mearsheimer, I assume, is talking specifically about people in Washington, but he needs to make that very clear, because there were many people warning about the nationalist, expansionist aspirations of the Russian Federation under Putin's Russia for a long time, and the rest of the world needs to offer a bit of a mea culpa for not listening when we had the chance.
Let me now turn to the real cause of the Ukraine crisis and ultimately the Ukraine war. The taproot is the American-led effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. That strategy has three prongs. One, integrating Ukraine into the EU. Two, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. You all know about the Orange Revolution. And three, and most importantly, incorporating Ukraine into NATO.
I don't agree that incorporating Ukraine into NATO is the most important of those three objectives. Certainly, getting rid of corruption, improving the rule of law, making Ukraine more desirable for investment, incorporating Ukraine economically into the rest of the EU bloc, that would have been way above the list in terms of the goals of Western European allies. Incorporating Ukraine into NATO is a net negative for NATO. It would mean that it would be defending Ukraine from Russia in a way far beyond what NATO has been doing during the actual war, and many countries in Europe were deeply skeptical of expanding NATO to incorporate Ukraine, including many people in the United States. And Putin himself says this in his speeches, that he recognizes that many in NATO were skeptical of expanding NATO to include Ukraine, but wanted long-term guarantees that that would not occur. The fact that there weren't roll gold guarantees that NATO would ever be prevented from expanding to include Ukraine, that's what Vladimir Putin was objecting to. He did not see it as imminent that this would occur, and yet he brought the war on anyway.
The strategy was set in motion at NATO's annual summit in Bucharest in April 2008, when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. That's in quotes, will become members. Russian leaders responded immediately with outrage, making it clear that this decision was an existential threat to Russia, and they had no intention of letting either country join NATO. According to a respected Russian journalist, Putin, quote, flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern regions. It will simply fall apart. That's Putin talking in 2008. William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. This is at the time of the Bucharest summit. He wrote a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that succinctly describes Russian thinking about Ukraine joining NATO. And you want to pay very careful attention to what Burns said, and then what I'm going to tell you Angela Merkel has recently said. This is Burns. This is his memo. He's the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. It's his memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. NATO, he said, would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Today's Russia will respond.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with Burns' memo to Condoleezza Rice. Absolutely, the entire Russian elite would rebel if Ukraine joined NATO. The question is, did Putin think that was imminent and that the only way to prevent it was to invade? The answer to that question is clearly no. Putin himself acknowledges in the 21st February speech that many countries in Europe are skeptical of Ukraine joining NATO, that Ukraine joining NATO would not happen tomorrow, and therefore this is purely a pretext for other motivations. So, for example, China has said that if Taiwan declares independence, that is a red line. China will invade. But it's a different thing to say, we're going to invade Taiwan now and incorporate Taiwan back into the mainland. That would certainly be a pretext, because there is no appetite for Taiwan to declare independence. And if China was to invade to ostensibly prevent that, it would purely be a pretext to incorporate Taiwan back into the mainland, which is a long-standing Chinese objective. So the same is true for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. While, yes, if Ukraine joined NATO, the Russians across the board would see that as a direct military threat, the fact that that is a specter that Putin knows is not imminent and is still using it as his explanation for invasion basically exposes the idea that Putin has expansionist imperialist ambitions and isn't doing this primarily out of fear of NATO expansion. So this is a clear point of disagreement between John and myself on this subject.
Russian-Ukrainian relations will go into a deep freeze. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Burns, of course, was not the only policymaker who understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was fraught with danger. Indeed, at the Bucharest summit, at the summit itself, both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy were opposed to moving forward on NATO membership for Ukraine because they feared it would infuriate Russia. Angela Merkel recently explained her opposition in an interview. I'm quoting Angela Merkel, "I was very sure that Putin is not going to let this happen. From his perspective, that would be a declaration of war."
Professor Mearsheimer is making my point for me. Back in 2008, everybody recognized that the expansion of NATO to include Ukraine would be perceived in Russia as a declaration of war. None of them had an appetite for it, so it was completely off the table. So why suddenly, in 2022, does Vladimir Putin see this as an existential threat, given that everybody in the European elite across the leadership positions were all on the same page about this, that essentially whatever we say in public, NATO cannot be expanded to include Ukraine? This is clearly a pretext for war. This is something that Putin has initiated to change the status quo that had no prospect of changing on its own. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, one of the great catastrophes, the strategic disasters from a Russian point of view of his invasion, is he's invited exactly what he had hoped ostensibly to prevent. Finland, Sweden, they are joining NATO. They had no appetite for doing it before the war. Ukraine may well end up in NATO in the future. And a complete disaster from a Russian point of view. But the idea that this was done to prevent all of these things from occurring is totally false.
And pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public pronouncement that said unequivocally that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Unsurprisingly, the American-led effort to integrate Georgia into NATO resulted in a war between Georgia and Russia in August 2008.
That is not why the war in Georgia occurred. They're essentially coincidental, although the support that Georgia was receiving rhetorically that it might eventually join NATO, even though there was never any prospect realistically of that happening, would have caused the Georgians to behave in a certain way that perhaps was contrary to their own interest.
The argument is that in the 8 years between when the crisis broke out and when the war broke out this past February, the United States and its allies paid little attention to bringing Ukraine into NATO. In effect, the issue had been taken off the table, and thus NATO enlargement could not possibly have been an important cause of the escalating crisis in 2021 and the subsequent outbreak of war earlier this year.
To be fair to Professor Mearsheimer here, he is articulating back my critique. I'm very curious as to see how he responds.
This line of argument is false. In fact, the Western response to the events of 2014 was to double down on the existing strategy and effectively make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. The alliance began training the Ukrainian military in 2014, averaging 10,000 trained troops annually over the next 8 years. NATO was training 10,000 troops per year for 8 straight years. In December 2017, the Trump administration decided to provide Kyiv with defensive weapons. Other NATO countries quickly got into the act, shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine's military participated in joint military exercises with NATO forces. In July 2021, less than a year ago, Kyiv and Washington co-hosted Operation Seabreeze, a naval exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries and was directly aimed at Russia.
Again, I agree. NATO does that with countries all around the world. They pointed out that many of the exercises included representatives from 31 countries. There is nothing unusual about that, and there's nothing unusual about that for Russia. So I agree that it would have been irksome for the Russian government, but it doesn't change the political reality that Ukraine was not going to join NATO. Therefore, using that as an excuse for invading Ukraine is false. And Mearsheimer has failed, in my opinion, to put forward the argument that any of this cooperation, interoperability, mutual support, etc., was part of making Ukraine part of NATO. And this is, I think, just a point of difference. He's saying it's a de facto NATO member, but it's not. I mean, Russia has invaded Ukraine. If Ukraine was a NATO member, de facto or otherwise, that would have placed an obligation on the other NATO members to come to Ukraine's defense. None of the other NATO members have done that. So it's false. It's just not a strong enough argument. The argument is a good lawyer's position, but I think fails on the facts.
Unsurprisingly, on June 14th, 2021, about a year ago, almost a year ago to the day, NATO issued the following communique at its annual Brussels summit. I'm going to quote, we reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, as an integral part of the process. We reaffirm all elements of that decision. We reaffirm all elements of that decision, as well as subsequent decisions, including that each partner will be judged on its own merits. We stand firm in our support for Ukraine's right to decide its own future and foreign policy course, free from outside interference. On September 1st, 2021, Zelensky visited the White House, where Biden made it clear in his public statements that the United States was, quote, firmly committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Then, on November 10th, 2021, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his Ukrainian counterpart signed an important document. It's called the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. It's available on the website or on the internet if you're interested. This is what it says. The aim of both parties is to, quote, underscore a commitment to Ukraine's implementation of the deep and comprehensive reforms necessary for full integration into Europe and Euro-Atlantic institutions.
Okay, this is far and away the strongest and most penetrating argument that Mearsheimer has made so far. That whatever the private feelings of the leaders in Europe and the Washington elite, the public statements are unambiguous. NATO says that Ukraine will join NATO. Zelensky visits Biden and the communique says that they're committed to implementing all of the reforms necessary to incorporate Ukraine into European institutions. And therefore, Russia is entitled to believe that that is the direction Ukraine is going in. America's obsession with strategic ambiguity, often in defiance of all reason, is an enduring weakness of US grand strategy. So, for example, it awoke in Zelensky's mind after the invasion was already underway that there was no appetite in Europe for Ukraine to join NATO. That's one of the things that led to great disillusionment, because he may have made much better strategic choices to prepare himself if he knew that Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO. Likewise, take the nuclear assurance guarantees, particularly in the Baltic region, where NATO has expanded. Therefore, America, on paper at least, must protect the Baltic countries with nuclear weapons. Will that ever happen? Under what circumstances? That's totally unclear, and it's very difficult for America to convey credibility on their allies' behalf because of their policy of strategic ambiguity, because the range of contingencies in which such use or defense could occur is vanishingly small. It's not in the allied interests not to know these things. There needs to be some hard discussions between allied and partnered leaders and the US establishment about what America will and will not do and under what circumstances, and remove that ambiguity, because it's not helpful. It was helpful during the Cold War in defending Western Europe, when America was bluffing a lot of the time and relying heavily on rapid escalation to nuclear weapons. But in a world where America has a range of strategic options, greater clarity is absolutely essential. So I agree with Mearsheimer on that point. Where I disagree is that I recognize, like Zelensky does now, that there was never an intention really to bring Ukraine into NATO. And when we talk about Mearsheimer's extensive research on leaders and why they lie, I agree they primarily lie to the public and that they lie less to one another. But I would also say that they lie the least to their adversaries in private. But they often tell their friends and partners what they want to hear, what they think their partners want to hear, if it's of low cost to themselves. And I think that's certainly true of the way the US treats its allies all around the world, including Australia, that there is so much positive rhetoric and not enough hard talk. And I agree with Mearsheimer on this. Where we disagree is that he's saying that there was an intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO, and I'm saying there never was. Zelensky was misled there, but Putin was not. Many other leaders were telling Putin the truth, that it was absolutely no appetite to bring Ukraine into NATO. It was certainly not imminent, and therefore to wage war on that basis is spurious.
Some argue that while that may be true, it should not have concerned Russian policymakers. We have decided it shouldn't have concerned Russian policymakers. Why? Because NATO is a defensive alliance and poses no threat to Russia. But that's not how Putin and other Russian leaders think about NATO. And it is what they think, not what you think or I think, that matters. And they see NATO as a direct threat. They see NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. They see it as the brightest of red lines.
I generally agree that those who argue NATO is purely a defensive alliance often overstate their case. NATO has conducted operations in Libya, in Kosovo, And so it's not that it purely defends its own territory. I do think it would be helpful to institute new rules in NATO to say the only circumstance under which NATO can conduct operations beyond the borders of NATO is if a NATO member is directly attacked, i.e. if they're invaded, then the NATO forces can repel that invasion and then punish whoever it is that invaded them, but not as a collective go and bomb some third country. I think that has undermined the message somewhat. And I do think that if, for example, Mexico or Canada joined a military alliance with some other power in some other part of the world that was ostensibly to defend against the United States, the Americans would see that as a direct and imminent threat, and they would absolutely respond. So NATO expansion per se does feed into Russian threat perceptions. The question is whether that explains or much less justifies the invasion of Ukraine, and certainly it doesn't. But when Mearsheimer says it's the Russian view, not our view, that matters, it's true insofar as what the threat perceptions are, but whether it actually justifies consequential action, which is what Mearsheimer ultimately is arguing. The West is responsible for what happened in Ukraine. He's overstating that case. The objective analysis is that expansion of NATO has not been a direct military threat to Russia, although I totally agree that that strongly feeds into Russia's threat perceptions.
Putin's aim was to coerce Biden and Zelensky into altering course and putting an end to their efforts to integrate Ukraine into the West. On December 17th, 2021, the Russians reached the boiling point, and Moscow sent separate letters to NATO and to Biden. Many of you, I'm sure, remember when the Russians sent those letters to Biden and to NATO, demanding a written guarantee that, number one, Ukraine would not join NATO, no offensive weapons would be stationed near Russia's borders, and three, NATO troops and equipment moved into Eastern Europe since 1997 would be moved back to Western Europe.
These were the only things Russia demanded. They expected outlandish things as well, such as not allowing US forces to be stationed outside of its own territory, things that could never be agreed to. As Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, put it, USSR negotiating position was always to demand 300% of what you wanted, and then someone will give you something you didn't have before. This belligerent stand that Russia has taken, I think, was extremely harmful to its own interests in these negotiations. A far better strategy would have been to appeal to American reasonableness, to say, look, NATO has expanded to 150 kilometers of St. Petersburg. We're really worried about the Ukraine integration with NATO, and just lay it all out calmly and then ask for modest changes. The Americans could then ask for reciprocal changes to say, okay, we will draw down some heavy weapons in the Baltic region, but we have to also assure the Baltic countries that their security is protected. Therefore, you must do commensurate steps to remove forces from Kaliningrad, Belarus, and the west of Russia, and that way we can de-escalate across the board. As for Ukraine joining NATO, well, we can never say publicly that Ukraine can't join NATO because NATO has an open door policy, but perhaps we can have a secret protocol that if NATO was ever to declare formal candidate status for NATO membership, those secret protocols could be made public, right? So you will have a written guarantee, but it must be kept private. If they're ever revealed outside of those circumstances, then we'll tear it up and Ukraine will join NATO. That's the kind of negotiating strategy that the US could have concluded with Russia if Russia was serious. And we had something similar to that in the Cuban Missile Crisis. America demanded the missiles be taken out of Cuba, but there were secret protocols. America agreed to remove nuclear weapons from Turkey within 6 months, as long as they weren't publicly linked to this negotiation. These things happen between great states all of the time that serve everybody's best interest. The fact that he's saying there were only these three modest demands, that's not true. Russia went and made themselves seem like crazy bullies. And so the reaction of ordinary American elites was one of revulsion and say, no, you get nothing, you get less than nothing, I don't want to hear about this anymore. Russia really brought this on themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to skip forward to the Q&A because we've moved beyond the causes of the conflict to the cost, the likelihood of a peace being brokered, and I generally agree the situation looks pretty bleak and that there won't be a negotiated solution. I disagree with Mearsheimer in the sense that I don't think there should be. I think Russian military defeat on the battlefield should be the ultimate goal. But let's get to the Q&A where we go back into some of the causes and reasons for why the conflict broke out and where the responsibility then lies.
Actually, I thought where you might go, a number of people have used this argument about me. You know, he made this speech about Peter the Great the other day, and he made it clear that Peter the Great had imperial ambitions and was interested in reconquering, I'm choosing my words carefully here, reconquering territory that the Swedes and others had taken away from Russia. And then he, in a very opaque way, implied that he may be doing the same thing. He didn't mention Ukraine. But one could argue that, you know, he sees what he's doing now in Ukraine as similar to what Peter the Great did. That is, reconquering lost territory. That would contradict my argument. My counter to that is that he said that after the invasion. And I have words in there. I've thought about this long and hard. I think his goals have escalated. This is why I think, tragically, he's not going to give up that territory he's conquered. I think he's either going to incorporate that into Greater Russia or he's going to create independent republics. His goals have changed. My argument is there's no evidence before he went in that he was interested in conquering huge swaths of territory and incorporating it into Russia. It's like the Germans in World War I. I don't know how many of you know about the March 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Oh my God, it's amazing how much territory the Germans took from the Russians via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Of course, it was all eventually reversed, okay? But when the Germans went into the war in 1914, they did not have those war aims. They evolved as the war went on. And that's the great danger that we face with regard to Putin in Russia now that the war has started. That his war aims have elevated, and it'll make it impossible to recreate a vibrant Ukraine.
I think this is one of the most interesting remarks from Mearsheimer so far, that he sees Putin's war aims as having been evolved since the war began to actually want to seize parts of Ukraine and to incorporate it into Greater Russia. And he uses the example himself of the comments Putin made to an audience about Peter the Great, saying that Peter simply reclaimed territory that was previously removed from Russia by Sweden, and implying that Putin was the successor to Peter doing the same thing in Ukraine, i.e. that he's going to restore a Greater Russia, and that this is a new aim. Well, where Mearsheimer and I would disagree is I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Putin always wanted to restore the Russian Empire, even as recently as a couple of days before the war, in his 21 February speech, when he's saying that Ukraine was an artificial country. Instead of Sweden being the one that tore up Russian territory from his point of view, it was the Bolsheviks. That's why he looks back on the Bolsheviks with such antipathy. He's like, yes, the reason why we've lost all of this territory was because of the mistakes made by Soviet leaders of the past, and that his restoration of Greater Russia is simply remediating those mistakes. And so I don't think this is about NATO expansion. Certainly any incorporation of Ukraine into NATO would have seriously impeded Putin's aspiration of a Greater Russia, and therefore needed to move before that ever happened. And it's a good talking point for Putin, but I don't think that the evidence supports Mearsheimer's position, although I think he's got a perfectly sound theory, and it's a lot more logical and cohesive than many other people who are talking about this subject. And so I think my position has more evidence, but is also more logical that this is simply a continuation of Putin's original aspiration rather than a radical mind break just a couple of months into the war. If the war had been raging all across Ukraine for 5 years, 6 years, and things had happened in that time to change the circumstances on the ground, like his example of 1918 World War One, then I would certainly buy into the argument that things have changed. Mission creep is an endemic plague of most conflicts, and we can see that in Iraq, Afghanistan, countless others, Vietnam. And so, yes, it could have happened that way, but not at this stage. I think it is more likely this is consistent with how Putin sees himself, his legacy, and simply the restoration of Greater Russia being his great project. So Mearsheimer and I disagree on the history, but we are starting to converge on the situation now. He is moving closer to my position that Putin's war aims are currently much greater than what he previously believed.
Now, you say, what does winning the war mean? This is a great question, and one I don't have that much time to go into. But the American case is easy. Winning, as I said, is defeating the Russians in Ukraine and basically strangling the economy to the point where you knock them out of the ranks of the great powers. The Russian case is a trickier case. A lot of people say what we have to do is we have to allow Putin to save face. And I say, you don't want to think about it in those terms. You want to think about it in Clausewitzian terms. War is an extension of politics by other means. Don't get too wrapped around about what happens on the battlefield. The question is, what's the political goal here? And John's story is that the political goal is more than anything to make sure you have a neutral Ukraine. So winning for Putin is putting an end to Ukraine joining the West, joining NATO, joining the EU. So that's winning. And that's why in my formal comments, I said that for the Russians, if you hope to shut this one down, you've got to have a velvet divorce between Ukraine and NATO and the United States, and Ukraine has to be neutral. So that would be winning in that particular case.
Yeah, I agree with Mearsheimer's characterization. I think he put it very well, of what winning means for both sides. I think for Putin, victory in Ukraine means incorporating those parts of Ukraine that are Russian-speaking, that won't cause Russia a lot of trouble, into Russia, and the rest of Ukraine to be another Belarus. That's the vision that I think Putin has. And America, as Mearsheimer puts succinctly, is to essentially defeat Russia militarily on the battlefield and to strangle its economy and knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. I think that is true.
I'm in patience of answering the questions that have been asked and for your presentation.
Okay, so this is my reaction to Professor Mearsheimer's comments on the war in Ukraine. First of all, I respect dissent. I think dissent is far less risky than groupthink. It's the best way of avoiding monumental catastrophes, is to force decision makers to really think critically about what it is they're doing in foreign policy. And I would agree with Mearsheimer that America has made many mistakes over the past couple of decades purely because of that phenomena. And so we need the dissenters out there, including Mearsheimer. So I'm grateful that he's willing to risk ire in many circles to present this point of view. I think my argument is stronger. Mearsheimer is saying that Putin may have had some sort of intellectual break in the last couple of months where he radically changed his war aims and wants to restore a greater Russia, but didn't intend to do that beforehand. I think this is entirely consistent with Putin's long-standing ambition. I think he's seen himself as the successor for Peter and Ivan for his entire presidency and wanted to restore Greater Russia and is looking to do that for his legacy. And I think this is entirely consistent with realist principles and more logical. I think you have to make an intellectual jump to say Putin recognized in his own speeches in February that Ukraine joining NATO was not imminent, that there was significant skepticism for Ukraine joining NATO among European powers, and yet therefore you have to wage a war to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That just doesn't seem logically consistent to me, and I don't think that Professor Mearsheimer has made a conclusive case for that. Certainly not one that would justify the war. Has the United States foreign policy establishment been an abominable failure over the past 2 decades? Absolutely it has. They've made one disastrous mistake after another and no doubt contributed to the circumstances in which this crisis arose. But the balance of responsibility is firmly with the Russian leadership. Going forward, I think the best solution is the complete and total defeat of the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Russia has already experienced a geopolitical catastrophe through this war. Finland, Sweden joining NATO. Ukraine, which wasn't going to join NATO before, may well do so in the future. And so this has changed radically Russia's geopolitical situation. And so I think a very generous settlement with Russia should be on the cards once they have been utterly defeated on the battlefield. As in, we shouldn't punish Russia overmuch, because I think we don't want a stern resentment. Russia has made a massive, catastrophic mistake. They need to be utterly defeated. They must pay for that mistake. But there has to be a path at the end of it for Russia to reintegrate with the community of European nations in order to create a new normal. In other words, we should, from this absolute catastrophe of Putin's making, create a future that is better for everyone in Europe. If you found value in this discussion, hit the like button. This video took a lot longer to make than I actually expected. Obviously, these were long remarks that I had to review. Please subscribe. Most viewers are not subscribers. I really appreciate it when people subscribe. It helps grow the channel a ton. And otherwise, leave a comment down below and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.